Goedemorgen. Good morning. Welcome to our yearly Investor Council, which this year is part of our Climate Week. My name is André de Vos and I will moderate this workshop, which, as you already understand, will be in English. Our speaker this morning is Helena Viñes Fiestas, Deputy Global Head of Sustainability at BNP Paribas Asset Management. Helena will give a presentation on the EU-taxonomy for a sustainable economy. She will give an introduction of the EU-taxonomy and also go into detail on what this means for investors. Helena has split her presentation into 3 parts. After each part, there will be time for some questions. You can ask the questions through the chat box that you will see on your screen. Please mention your name and I will put forward the question to Helena. Okay, so then I will give the floor to Helena. Helena, good morning.
Good morning. Can you hear me well?
Yes, loud and clear. Nice to have you on our Climate Week, on our Investor Council, which is bit different than it normally is. Everything online, but I think it will be a very good session. I have your presentation ready, but maybe it's good for you to start with a short introduction of yourself, who you are, what you do at BNP Paribas.
Thank you. Dank u wel, although that's as far as my Dutch goes. So, as you said, I am Deputy Head of Sustainability, but I'm also Global Head of Stewardship and Policy at BNP Paribas Asset Management. So my role basically is around engaging with companies on ESG issues. It's about overseeing our vote, both in terms of pure corporate governance, but also on ESG issues. And at the same time, I'm in charge of everything that's policy development and engagement with policy makers. Mm-hmm. It is also worth very quickly to say that I've been a member of the technical expert group of the European Commission, who provides advice to the Commission on the development of sustainable finance strategy, but very much I have been working on the taxonomy. So that is very critical for today's presentation. And I will just close by saying that I have just been appointed to the platform, so I will continue to work on the taxonomy. So basically, just to say that the taxonomy and I, we have a pretty long relationship behind us and before us.
Just out of curiosity, when did this start? When did you start working on this taxonomy? How long ago is that?
Thank you. 2 years ago. So many of you might remember that the European Commission published in March 2019 the EC Action Plan on Sustainable Finance, also known as the Roadmap, European Roadmap on Sustainable Finance. Right after that, it made a call for experts to be part of this expert group that will advise them, generally speaking, on the plan, but particularly that will work in 4 areas. One is the taxonomy. The second one was the EU green bond standards, or voluntary standards for green bonds in Europe. Mm-hmm. The third one is on the upgrade of the guidelines of the non-financial reporting directive to really embed the recommendations of the task force on climate-related disclosures, and last but not least, on sustainable benchmarks, particularly the development of climate transition benchmark and a Paris-aligned benchmark.
Okay. Well, 2 years ago, that seems pretty fast for European standards.
Well, this is, as you will see in a minute, this is still work in progress. I have to say that although I have to really say that the work of the European Commission in sustainable finance has been incredible. Amazing work, really commendable in a very short period of time, particularly as you allude to, when you understand how this big machinery that we call the European Union works.
Okay. So well, I'll leave you to your presentation. As I mentioned, we have several parts where we can ask questions, where the viewers can ask questions. So I hope they'll come up with a lot of questions, but please start.
Thank you. So if you can put perfect. So as you already realize, in the next few minutes, I'm going to tell you about the slings and arrows of these recently born European taxonomy. But honestly, despite the fancy name, actually taxonomy just means classification. So it's just the list of economic activities that we can consider sustainable and under which circumstances. Now, before I go into the details, I want to reinforce or to highlight the two key objectives of the taxonomy. The first one is to provide clarity to end investors. And this is because we have all seen how the market on green finance has exploded recently. We talk about over 1 trillion of investments of dollars in green bonds. But really, can we really say that all those underlying assets are green when everyone, whether we talk about a company or an investor, not only determines what is green, but also how green they are? So clearly there is a problem, a language problem, because everyone has a different interpretation of what's green. So the number one role of the taxonomy is to provide that interpretation. A little bit like if you market your product as low fat, it is only fair to ask how much fat it has and whether or not that's too much. So the taxonomy is that reference point that allows everyone to know whether or not a product has too much fat or not. The second objective is much broader and probably much more important, which is to raise funds to finance the energy transition. Next slide, please. We are reaching planetary boundaries. We risk creating far-reaching, these feedback loops, which are beyond our capacity to handle. The consequences, of those, of reaching those boundaries and creating those feedback loops are beyond our capacity to control in our current economic framework. There is urgency in the environmental challenge, and I really want to highlight that it's not only about climate change, it is also about water, biodiversity, our ecosystems, land use, and so forth. The current crisis, and it has been evoked over and over, has a direct link with biodiversity loss. So, in other words, we do face unprecedented far-reaching catastrophes that will impact every single aspect of our lives, including our health. Now, it seems that showing these graphs and being conscious of this is not sufficient for the markets to really take these challenges into account. We all have wished that we had a system, a single pricing system that would capture those challenges, and that we might prefer, excuse me, I have to stop here because there is a terrible noise on the back.
We don't hear anything here, so.
Oh, okay.
If you can continue.
Just my connection.
No.
Okay, I'll do my best. It is, as I was saying, we would have preferred to have that single pricing system that captures those challenges that we can apply and automatically takes them into account in all our financial decisions, our models, etc., etc. Unfortunately, that does not happen. Even when it comes to carbon price, which is the best ever proxy for climate, we're so far away from having a meaningful and a global pricing that we cannot continue waiting for that to happen, let alone that we need a price for the rest of the environmental challenges. Therefore, what we need is to develop tools that will help us understand the extent of those challenges, how our investment decisions actually have an impact on those challenges, and how we can sort them out, how we can start resolve them. What we need is no longer limit our work on integrating, certain proxies in our investment thinking, but actually to start measuring and start really recognizing the impact that they have in the real world. Now, The taxonomy aims to do exactly that. The taxonomy aims to capture environmental performance through financial metrics and to allow us to make much more better informed investment decisions, so we can all, overcome these challenges, and particularly we raise the necessary funds to transform our economic system. The European Commission calculates around 290 billion of additional investments, of euros, of additional investments per year that we need from now to 2030 to reach our goal to at least half all emissions in Europe. And this is why the taxonomy has become the cornerstone of the European Action Plan. Now, without further delay, next slide, please. I'm going to introduce you. So today, as it's been said, I have divided my presentation in 3 blocks. Unfortunately, I cannot, the taxonomy, I've been working on it for 2 years, there's so much to talk about it that I need to limit what I share with you today. So I have divided presentation in 3 blocks, the 3 key traits or things that I think that are really necessary to understand, in order to understand the taxonomy, then what it means for investors, and then looking forward to the expansion of the taxonomy as the platform starts working. What is it? What is my opinion of what we investors need and we want to see in this taxonomy that, I shall remind everyone, is still work in progress, because what the tech has worked on is only in the climate taxonomy, and even when it comes to climate, we haven't covered all the economic activities. Great. Next slide, please. Next one. So the first trait is the double conditionality framework that I call. This is, I was saying that the taxonomy is nothing more than this list, yeah? I like to think about it like a living dictionary that anyone can take and use to look whether or not an economic activity can be considered environmentally sustainable and under which circumstances. In order to be considered environmentally sustainable, you need one economic activity needs to contribute substantially to one of the environmental objectives, but also it has to ensure that it doesn't harm significantly. And here is not only the other environmental objectives, which is the do no significant harm principle, but also not to undermine social standards. And this is what we call the minimum safeguards. That also includes a couple of governance standards, mainly anti-corruption and anti-bribery. So it is really important to understand that do no significant harm principle, it is about conducting thorough due diligence, that minimum safeguards are designed to ensure that the taxonomy activities do no harm social objectives. So in a way, it's like a form of do no significant harm to social aspects. Now, the taxonomy today does not cover social objectives. It ensures the highest social standards, but it doesn't cover social objectives. However, the platform, one of its tasks will be to recommend to the European Commission whether or not the taxonomy should be expanded to cover social objectives. Now, how do we capture that substantial contribution on one hand and do no significant on the other? Is through technical criteria. The regulation states that as much as we can, we need to come up with quantitative criteria and set up thresholds. But of course, when you talk about environmental, social issues, there's quite a few qualitative criteria, particularly around the social aspects, as you can imagine. Next slide, please. The other thing you really need to have in mind, so I was talking, is that the taxonomy is framed by the EU environmental objectives and science, and I'm going to explain it to you in a second. But first, let's look at the 6 environmental objectives that the taxonomy covers. So it's climate mitigation, climate adaptation, that's what I call the climate taxonomy. And then you have the sustainable and protection of waters and marine resources, transition to a circular economy, pollution prevention and control, and then protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. It's very important to understand that for each one of these objectives, which, by the way, they are the 6 objectives of the EU environmental plan, the EU has developed a specific strategy. In some cases, it is developing, as we speak, the update of those objectives. And those strategies also contain specific targets, right? So the taxonomy has been and will be developed in order to see how the different activities need to contribute to the realization of these objectives. And I'm going to give you in a minute an example, the example of the climate mitigation, because that's the big part in which we have worked so far. Now, the other point that is really important is that when setting those technical criteria and those thresholds that will help the different economic activities reach those environmental objectives, the regulation states very clearly that they need to be set up following scientific and evidence. They need to be scientific and evidence-based. So science will inform where we set the bar and what those thresholds should be. So in the case of climate change mitigation, the overall goal, as you know, is to become carbon neutral by 2050. And this is going to be enshrined in the next few months into EU climate law. It is also very timely, the discussion around the review of the 2030 targets. That used to be 40% emissions reduction. The Commission recently declared that we should aim for 55%, and then we're going to push for that. And yesterday, the European Parliament announced that they voted for 60%. So what's going to happen in the next few months is that the Parliament, the European Council, and the Commission will have to reach an agreement of whether it's going to be 50, 55%, or 60. Yes?
Which one of those percentages do you think is most realistic?
I think that if we stick to science, there are two, and this is an excellent question, there are 2 criteria. So from science, what the science is telling us is that if we want to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, which is our only chance to stick to 1.5 degrees, a scenario, then we need at least to reduce global emissions by 50%. So 50% should be the minimum. However, if we take also into account a more historical perspective and what should be the European Union contribution to that 50% global reductions, then we're talking more about 55, 60%. Some even say 65%. I think that 55% would be a really good compromise, and that's what the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, which we are part of, have been calling for and still calling for. And we did write a letter to all the heads of states, and we published a paper on that calling for 55%. So we'll be quite happy if it's 55%. Okay. And the taxonomy has already taken that into account.
Okay.
Okay, so if we see next slide, it might made much clearer what we were talking about in terms of how the taxonomy works. So the taxonomy, in a way, it's almost, think about it like a green procurement plan for 2050. We know that we need to be carbon neutral by then. So what we have looked at is what science tells us and what is the EU long-term strategy to reach that goal. And we work backwards. So what you have in front of you is actually very symbolic, I would say, very telling graph, which is from the EU 2050 long-term strategy of how the different activities need to reduce emissions. And what it is very striking, if you look at where we are today from 2020 to 2050, is how steep that curve is. Because, as you know, and this is what we were discussing, in less than 10 years, we need to halve emissions at the very least, and then we need to go down to 0 in 30 more years. Now, 30 years is no longer that, I mean, in 20 more years. 30 years is no longer that long term. When we think about the lifespan of some of our investments, particularly in infrastructure and in certain areas, those investments might have a longer lifespan than 30%, which basically what science is telling us is that any infrastructure investment and certain other types of certain investments, that have a lifespan of more than 30 years needs to be today already fit for purpose. So fit for a carbon neutral economy, yeah? Or at the very least, they cannot mean carbon lock-in. What does that mean? It means that if I do an investment today that is not fit for that purpose, but there is a better technology and I know, then I would have later on to make a double investment to, in a way, to really adapt that investment to that goal, yeah? And sometimes it might mean even that investment has no life, becomes fully stranded, after a certain date. So this is why it is so important for investors and public authorities to really understand those curves. Now, what the taxonomy has done so far is open out the eyes of all of us to this idea, and to really see how this idea that we used to have, that a transition is about incremental steps towards that goal that is really far away, is no longer valid. If we had done our homework over the past 20, 30 years, yes, that would have been the case. But the reality is that today, in less than 10 years, we need to, at the very least, have all our emissions. So the reality and what science is telling us is that no new unabated generation of electricity or investments on unabated fossil fuel infrastructures can be done. And we need to realize that. And we need to realize that what we're talking about, it's about transformational change in almost every sector of our economy. And I would highlight that from a pure investment perspective, this is not only about sustainability or climate change in this case, but it's also about digitalization. And when you put both together, hand in hand, you realize to what extent market dynamics are changing so much that many of the sectors in which we invest are at a crossroads, whether we talk about transport, electricity generation, and so many others. So the key point here is that the taxonomy is fully compatible with those transition pathways, that the taxonomy sets those objectives for the different activities. So it's not about a corporate level, and it is at an activity level. And the taxonomy, you need to understand that it doesn't look activity as a sector, but it goes really down to a level of detail on activity. So it will split the manufacturing from the distribution, from the commercialization, etc. So it looks at every single step of the value chain as a different activity.
Can I have a look? Ask a question about this graph?
Yes.
I can't really tell, but does it say that every sector has to have the same, goes down by the same percentage? Transport,
No,
power,
yeah.
industry.
Very good question. No, if you look at, and it is a very generic, it doesn't include all the sectors, but if you look at it, what it does, like take a bit, if you compare residential with industry, it is the width of the band, the color band, that tells you the extent of the effort. So if you look at power, you see that power is absolutely fundamentally has to go from having a huge, right, huge emissions, right, to really tiny one. You see it, 2050, the yellow one. And then when you compare the purple, for instance, you see that the reduction is less. It's less dramatic. And that gives you a very good sense. And then when you look at the red, because another point that is very important is that the taxonomy is technology neutral. And what that means that the only activity that is excluded is coal. And that's been excluded in the taxonomy regulation. So coal is excluded by law. right? Which is what it's called in the regulation, solid fossil fuels. The rest of activities, they can all play a role in the economy, except that in this case, as it says very clearly in the presentation, in the case of fossil fuels, they need to be unabated. What that means is that for gas to be included in the taxonomy, it needs to meet the threshold. And the only way for gas to meet the threshold is through CCUS, or in the case of green hydrogen.
CCUS, sorry,
So,
CCUS?
Carbon capture and storage and what is called recycled.
Yes.
Yeah, this is a thing.
Yep.
So basically what it's saying is that this is not at all the end of oil and gas companies. This is telling companies how they need to invest their capex, how they need to diversify their portfolios. This is telling an oil and gas companies that in order to meet the net zero, which by the way, all EU major oil and gas companies have committed to net zero through the Climate Action 100 Plus Alliance that we've been leading on together with other investors. And for instance, we led on engagement with Total, and Total has engaged to become net zero by 2050, scope 1 and 2 and 3 in Europe, and scope 1 and 2 in the rest of the world. So what does that mean for Total? For Total means that they need to really diversify. In fact, they're becoming one of the major players in renewables. And people forget that oil and gas companies are probably the biggest investors in that area. But it means also that they need to start looking at plastic recycling, at green hydrogen, and at CCUS and all these technologies.
Okay.
So that's what the taxonomy does. It gives you that procurement plan. It sets the objectives. It helps you to really see what's going to become stranded, what not, and give you all these incentives to go towards that.
Okay, thank you.
Next slide, please. So I want to finish this bit, and it is a corollary of my past slide, which is the taxonomy does include transition activities. So traditional, I was talking at the very beginning how one of the roles of the taxonomy is to provide clarity of what is green or not. And I wonder in the audience, and this is a question for all of you, how many of you have green funds that include companies in areas such as in activities such as cement or steel? We don't have any. And the reason is double. One is because if we include them, we fear to be accused of greenwashing. And the second one is because we don't have the scientific knowledge to really set under which conditions really those activities could be considered green. What the taxonomy does, and I think this has been one of the greatest achievements of the tech, was to divide climate mitigation activities into three categories. The classic, what we consider normally green, so that are already low carbon. That means activities that already have almost reached that net zero. Those ones who are almost there at the end at 250. And then enabling activities that are also typically in green funds, which are those activities that they provide the necessary services, products, and technologies for the rest of the activities in the economy to transition. So, for instance, if a low carbon activity would be wind energy, then the enabling activity will be the manufacturing of the wind turbines, right? Now, the addition of the tech was to include activities that contribute to the transition. And here what is really, really important to understand is that then the regulators took on board that, and then the Council, the Commission, and the Parliament, they reached an agreement of what were the preconditions for any economic activity to be able to be included as a transitioning activity. And that's really important because a lot of people have been criticizing the thresholds as they're so demanding, this doesn't really reflect the reality. But we need to understand two things. One is we've seen all the steepness of the curve, and how hard it is that the work that we need to do, particularly for certain activities. And secondly, is that the regulation by law says that number one, the thresholds need to reflect best performance in each sector. So the best technology. So if we look at cement, we looked at, okay, what is the best technology available today that can really help to lower the emissions, correct? And this will reflect between 5 to 15% of the most of the sector. Number two, that there cannot be any carbon lock-in emissions. And that activity must be absolutely necessary for the economy. It cannot have a replacement. And when you start understanding the conditions that the law has put in place, then you would start understanding why certain activities are not in the taxonomy and why some thresholds might be so strict. And with that, I think I finished the first part. Next slide, and I will, if you have any questions, I will be more than happy to take them. Otherwise, I will continue.
Yes, I have a question on this slide because it's I find it rather complicated, and I can't have the view of the faces of the online audience. But does this mean that at one certain moment companies will have like a label? This is a transition activity.
Oh, very good question. In fact. And that really relates to the next part. The taxonomy, and this is also very important to understand, is this reference, right? This guide, this dictionary we can use. But the taxonomy has there's absolutely no obligation, legal obligation linked to the taxonomy other than reporting, okay? So the only legal, it's around reporting. What we investors really need to understand is that we will have to report on our investments, the alignment of our funds, and maybe we can, if you can quickly go to the following.
Yes, I have a question from the audience. Maybe I would put that forward.
So maybe can I answer your question?
Yes.
Because I'm going to really address it in the next, and I'll answer you then in the next phase. Okay, yeah, right there. I'm going to answer it. But I can take the question from the audience first.
Yes,
then,
okay.
Yes.
It's a question from Jürgen Franzen. I think it has to do partly with this, with what you're going to explain next. But when do you expect investment funds to be available for investors in the marketplace with the EU Eco label?
Very good question as well. So may I explain the disclosures bit and how it works, and then I'll answer both the questions because they're so intimately related that you will understand much better if you understand first what the reporting obligations are.
Okay, so we'll go back to the slide, yes.
Perfect. So, as I was saying, there's no obligation, legal obligation, other than a reporting one. And that means that at no time there's any obligation of investing in A or B or a minimum requirement, yeah? The only thing that it says is like with low-fat products. If you commercialize your product as low-fat, you need to tell how much fat that is and whether or not it's too much, right? Meaning what you need to add is the recommended daily intake of fat. Well, the taxonomy is the same. If you commercialize your fund as green, that means that it has an environmental objective or an environmental characteristic, yeah? Then you need to say how and to what extent the investments underlying the financial product are invested in environmental sustainable economic activities, yeah, and how it relates to the taxonomy. So basically, let's give it an example. We have an energy transition fund. That is a fund actually that we do have. And so how and extent, for the first question, we would say we invest all those companies that have at least 20% of their revenues derived from taxonomy-aligned activities, in this case, climate taxonomy-aligned activities, they fit, they are qualified for our fund. And then, of course, in other questions, we might answer what other type of criteria or preconditions we have. Then I would say, what is the overall objective of this fund? In this case, I would say it's 100% focused on climate mitigation. So it's an energy transition fund, correct? And then what I need to do is calculate, what is the alignment with the taxonomy. And basically what I would do is imagine it's a European equity fund, then because, and then I do a little pause or parentheses, because European companies, all European companies that fall under the scope of the non-financial reporting directive, by law, will have to disclose from 2022 not only the percentage of alignment of their revenues, but also the percentage of alignment of their OPEX and CAPEX. So for European companies, it will be a very simple exercise. I will have 3 companies, as you have in front of you. Each one of them will give me their, because it's an equity fund, I will tend to use revenues. So then I will just track that. And, depending on the weight of each one of the companies in the fund, then I will have, the end result, the alignment. Now, the regulation is telling me that it doesn't matter if it's 0.1% aligned or if it's 99% aligned. Yeah? All I need to do is to provide that figure. Now, there are 2 things here. One is, and we'll talk about that later, what happens when it's a non-European company, right? That means that I need to do a little bit more work, although we do understand providers will mostly do that work. But that is for the third part of the presentation. The second point, it's about, well, there is no minimum requirement, correct? And that is true, except for the labels, because there is a second degree of linked to the taxonomy regulation, and that is for the authorities, whether we're talking about European or member states, which is that any member state or European authority that sets a standard or label for green financial products needs to use the European taxonomy as the reference and as the base. What does it mean? That the future eco-label, that is for retail investors, needs to be based on the taxonomy. But it also means that, for instance, in France, that we have a national official label for green funds called Greenfin, that the French government will have to replace the current taxonomy with the EU taxonomy. And that is valid across Europe. Another question would be what happens with the non-official, so like private labels. Well, while there's no obligation, I personally think we will see all these labels slowly, maybe, but that they will move and end up using the taxonomy, because the taxonomy will become, by default, the reference.
What do you mean by private Europe. Labels, Helena?
Febelfin.
Sorry?
Febelfin, Lux Flag, all these labels that they are voluntary.
Okay.
But it's not, so it's a private institution that has created, or a network. Yeah. But it's not the Belgian government or it's not the Luxembourg government that establishes it, as opposed to Greenfin, which has been established and is run by the French government. Now, on the eco label, so the first question was on the eco label. To say the eco label is work in progress. I'm also in that working group, and I have to say that it's been really interesting, because the eco label is not exclusive for financial products. The eco label is the label that we see on our detergents, right? On our in so many products across Europe. So there was it was very interesting to see how we adapt a regulation or a framework that is used for so many consumer products all of a sudden to be implemented for a financial product. And I think that's why it has taken longer than we would have expected. So the eco label should have been in place or agreed some time ago. It's still work in progress. We think, and this is personal, so this is not the Commission, this is not official, that it will take, probably it will start by 1st of January 2022, at the same time as the obligations, reporting obligations become, as the first round of reporting obligations come. So your question, you had sorry, I don't think I have answered your question.
This is the answer to Jürgen's question.
Yes, and yours was...
Well, my question was whether that has to do with the transitioning thing that companies actually can say, I am doing transitioning activities.
Yes, and that was an excellent question but we also need to disclose. So when I said my equity fund is 10.6% taxonomy aligned, as this example, then I also need to provide a breakdown and say how much of that is invested in enabling activities and how much in transitioning activities. So in this case, let's imagine, to make it very simple, that of that 10%, there's a 3% in enabling because company B, and I'm not doing the right math, so just forget about the numbers,
yes.
But company B invests in manufacturing of wind turbines, correct? Company A it's an electric utility and based on wind, okay? And that 12%. And the 50% that's there, it is let's say a cement company, correct? That meets 50% of the production, meets the thresholds of the taxonomy. So if I take into account the weight of the company C, that will give me, of that 10%, how much is in transition activities, and then I need to disclose the enabling. This is very interesting because so far the details of the disclosures for the companies has not been fully developed. That will be the delegated acts. Now we're getting into more like the slings and arrows of the regulation, And also, it has not been decided yet how financial undertakings that fall under the scope of the non-financial reporting directive, so banks and insurers, will need to disclose. Because obviously it makes no sense that they disclose the percentage of capex invested in taxonomy, because that has nothing to do with what the business of a bank is, and not what we're talking about. So whether it will be the percentage of the corporate lending portfolios that falls under the taxonomy, or what assets will be included, that's yet to be decided. And this is what is going to be decided from now on until the June, if I recall correctly, June 2021. So one of the roles of the platform will be to give advice on that details of the disclosures, and provide also guidance for both companies and financial actors to help them meet their reporting requirements.
So maybe it's good to continue with your presentation, also looking at the time here.
Oh, yes. So, yes, we're getting. Another thing I wanted to say very quickly about this is that it is very important when looking at the taxonomy to understand that the taxonomy is only one piece of a much bigger puzzle, And it is that interlink with that machinery, and the whole sustainable finance strategy that gives the importance to the taxonomy, because as you can see, by far is much more cumbersome the disclosures regulation than the taxonomy. But what we need to understand is, first, one thing, that I don't know how many of you are aware that the MiFID has been modified to include ESG preferences in suitability tests. Basically, this means that you not only have to look at the risk profile of your client and financial profile, but also their ESG preferences. So if I ask you, do you have a preference for environmental friendly products, or you want to ensure that they don't have a negative impact in the environment, I will have to give you an offer that's coherent with that. And you will have, let's make it simple, 2 funds, right? And each one of those 2 funds, you would have one common denominator. And this is the first time where you have in front of you that we have a common measurement tool. That means that we have allows consistent reporting. So that means compare apples with apples. And this one is going to be 5% compliant. This is 70% compliant. So we can start understanding why the taxonomy is such an incentive, because we hope, or the expectation is that people will have a preference for those products that have a higher level of alignment.
Okay.
Next slide, please.
Okay. Yes.
Which links to this, which is for me probably the most important of what I'm saying today, is that on one hand, we will have the funds who will use revenues as the key financial metric, yeah? And normally those will be the equities. So if I continue to work with my example, I will have, for my green financial products, I'll have an incentive to increase that percentage of greenness, right? So that by default means that there are certain stocks that they will be quite demanded because they make my fund look really good. And also because they allow me to have that freedom to also include, stocks that might be extraordinarily interesting from a valuation point of view, even if the taxonomy alignment is lower. But while that is important and we need to take into account, for me, that's by far not the most important thing, because revenues give us the picture of what companies are today. And what we've been talking about the whole time is that the taxonomy importance really is because it sets that direction of travel, sets the objectives. So the most interesting part of the taxonomy, it's on the expenditure side, it's on the CapEx side. It's about how those expenditures are consistent with the strategies on transition that they share with investors. And because you need to understand that the taxonomy is not only, when I say that it's consistent with the EU objectives, it is also consistent with the EU policy and the EU carbon markets, which are going to be reformed again, which basically means that the taxonomy is preempting me of future regulation. Yeah. So even if the taxonomy today, compliance is the best practice, best of best, yeah, that in a few years' time, and we know we're talking about very few years' time, will be common practice and will be the regulatory expectation. So the motivations for companies to become taxonomy aligned is quite important. And the way the taxonomy works is that any expenditure, CapEx investment, whether it is any loan that they might ask the bank or any green bond, as long as they are invested to become taxonomy alignment and they're part of an investment plan that it can be 5 years maximum, then they can be taxonomy aligned, which means that the possibilities in the debt and lending market are huge. And although the banking products are not included in taxonomy regulation, they're not included except for those who are sold to investors. So if they are the constituent of a fund that is sold to investor. So basically there's going to be a huge incentive for everything that goes from green mortgages, asset-based securities, structured products, and anything that's green loans and green bonds, because the demand is going to be huge. And I think that here is where the most beautiful part of the taxonomy lies, because this is meant to be an incentive and have an impact in reality in access, in helping companies get, greater or give companies greater access to green finance. Next slide, please. This I have already mentioned a little bit about the links of the taxonomy with the ESG preference test, the eco label, the green bond standard. But I also want to make a statement or share with you what's the debate today. So what you have above on the top part of the slide is what is already a reality. Yeah, but what the debate is currently, and many of you would know that the European Commission will be publishing the renewed sustainable finance strategy by the end of 2020, is what other uses the taxonomy might have. And the most exciting one is that now the discussion is how the public sector should use it. And this is not around public linked pensions and central banks investment, but it's also around what role it should play on green budgeting and on green procurement. Yeah, should the taxonomy linked products be a default option for saving schemes, for pension schemes, and to what extent the recovery plan, need to be based on the taxonomy. And what we know today is that the next generation EU, that's 750 billion euros, a part of the recovery plan, are going to be invested in climate-related projects, and the taxonomy will be the reference for those projects, which is really good news. We also know that the Commission will dedicate and has committed 25 to 28% of its own budget to climate-related projects in line with the taxonomy. So now you can start getting a picture, a real picture of how impactful the taxonomy is, because it links not only private sector praxis, but also with public sector, and finally, and most importantly, with EU policy, and is at the very core of the Green Deal. Now, I had another part which is moving forward, but before going there, I just want to ensure that there are no burning questions, because we don't want to leave without
we have a question here. We have several questions, but I've at least one question I'm going to ask. We also have 10 minutes left, so just for your...
Yes.
I will put the question first. Margreet Verhoef of the Bakery Pension Fund. What is the role of the two benchmarks, EU Climate Transition Benchmark and EU Paris Aligned Benchmark? So what is their role, and are they investable?
So the benchmarks are two. So one is the climate transition benchmark, aims to frame and provide a framework to all the low carbon benchmarks that exist. Yeah. So basically establishes what are the minimum requirements for those benchmarks that actually are in line with the transition. And that's the importance. So it provides a lot of clarity, is going to structure this type of benchmarks. Now, the one who is really challenging, and I'm not going to deny that, is the Paris Aligned benchmark. And that's because the Paris Aligned benchmark, in a way, is looking at that 2050 economy. So there is, there's a lot of work that we need to do, and there are not that many current investments that would fit that. I've seen very interesting climate transition funds, benchmarks, that have come out in the market. I have to say that I have not seen a Paris Aligned fully benchmark, but maybe it's because I've been so into the taxonomy that I missed something. But I do recognize that the Paris alignment is more aspirational, if you wish. Okay. But looking forward,
The second part of the question was, are they investable yet?
Yes, that's what I said. Oh. That on the first one, the climate transition benchmark, definitely. Mm-hmm. The Paris alignment, I still haven't seen anything. Yeah, yes. But maybe I have missed.
Okay, so we'll continue with your presentation.
Yes. So if we go, and I'll try to be very succinct here, and this is moving forward. So this is in a way, what you're going to say and what investors want, and excuse my arrogance here, it's a little bit like what my wish list is moving forward, and what I think that we investors, we need to see happening in the taxonomy. So the first point, it's really important, which is, I was mentioning before that for European companies, it's going to be quite straightforward, right? Because that information by law is going to be given by the companies, and that the current revision of the non-financial reporting directive includes looking at the specific indicators and the methodologies, underlying methodologies. The platform will have a special working group around the usability, so the implementation of the taxonomy, that includes data availability and data standardization, and will be linked with the working group, with those who are working on the revision of non-financial reporting directive. However, we are global, our funds are global, the majority, so we need that information from other regions. So one of the key things that need to happen in order to make the taxonomy work is that we need more and more standardized, reliable and quality data. We know that data providers are the ones who are going to give us the data. Yeah, we will probably, our exercise will be as simple as what I showed, but for non-European companies, there will be a lot that will be estimated or proxies, and there's a lot of clarity that still needs to happen. My one message clearly is that if we have at global level managed to have a pretty common understanding of what revenues is, turnover or capex, why cannot we really start working on having a common understanding on some of the key environmental metrics and the methodology to develop them. Second slide, next slide, please. So my second one is that the current taxonomy is absolutely fun. I think it is a perfect start. It's work in progress. It's very technical. That's what we were asked to, and rightly so. But we need to understand that there is a difference when you apply that to large funds, 12,000 companies, to small companies, that when you apply it to a project, for financing a project, that there is a difference between applying the taxonomy for a green mortgage for household, then when you apply it for a large, public infrastructure investment. So what we need now is adapting the taxonomy for the different users and users, simplify and provide tools for all the different users in order to facilitate their reporting as well as use of the taxonomy. And we need much more guidance, detailed that's not only how to report, but also how to conduct due diligence. And I think that regulators need to be clearer on what the expectations in that are. I won't go into the details, but there are some, I believe that in order to facilitate the use of the taxonomy by non-EU companies and non-EU players, we need to start creating those equivalence tables, right? So almost like now we have our own dictionary, now we need to write the translations into the different languages, so into the different classifications. Next slide, please. And just to wrap up, and I will finish, I will on that note say it's really important for all of us to know that the Commission also launched last year a platform, an international platform on sustainable finance that precisely has that role, which is to start working on standardized frameworks. And that's why I really insisted on the environmental metrics and the need to standardize those. You have in front of you the names of the countries that are part of the platform. Every day there's a new country. The UK is discussing, they are in discussions, and we hope that the UK includes it. And just to say that other regions are also working on taxonomies. The majority of them are using the EU taxonomy, which is great news, as the base. You have there for me what they are like the 3 key traits of any taxonomy that needs to happen. Yesterday we had a discussion with the Canadian working group on their taxonomy. The other day with the Chileans. I mean, it's really fascinating to see how other parts of the world are getting excited about the taxonomy, developing their own taxonomy. We just hope that they are the most similar as possible. And the last slide, and we'll finish with that. I said at the very beginning that what we really needed are tools to help us understand, and tools to help us make better decisions, but also to really capture the environmental impact of our investments. The taxonomy, and for me, is, yes, a dictionary, or for a long time it was only a dictionary, but the more I got to know the taxonomy, the more uses I found. So for me, it's more like a Swiss knife that, the more you get to know it, the more uses that you find. And I want to leave you with the idea of don't get put off by the taxonomy because it's too technical. We will develop user-friendly tools and internet tools to make it easier. Think about it as a tool to help you. It's a dictionary, but it's also the measuring tool. It's also a transition tool. You can use it for your engagements. It is a policy tool to contrast the policies in the different sectors. And remember, it's work in progress, it's dynamic, it will be fed by science and the market, and it will be reviewed every 3 years. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Helena, for your time and for being perfectly on time as well, because it's 12 o'clock. I think we have time for one more question. I think it's a relevant question too. It's a question by Ivo Boon. And his question is, do you see a risk of too much focus on only carbon reduction with the taxonomy?
Excellent. Excellent question. I think that what we have today is effectively looking at carbon reduction. And I didn't talk much, but it also looks at adaptation, which, as one of my dearest colleagues of tech always says, is the little sister always ignoring all parties. So adaptation is also included. But the work of the platform in the next year and a few months will be to expand it to the other environmental objectives. I think that when we finish the taxonomy and we have biodiversity, water, and all those other really important issues inside the taxonomy, hopefully it would help to also give more attention to those sectors. I think that biodiversity is a critical one. And hopefully also investors will start paying more attention to the COPs, the biodiversity COPs, and the evolutions in those areas.
Okay. Thank you very much, Helena, for your presentation.
You're more than welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Bedankt ook publiek voor het kijken naar deze workshop en het meedoen met vragen. Wij zijn om 1 uur terug met een plenaire sessie. Dan zien we u om 1 uur weer terug. Dank u wel.